The mountains groaned with winter, a silence so deep it pressed against the walls of Garrett Boone's cabin, like another log laid heavy upon the timber. Outside, snow drifted in sheets curling against the eaves, the kind of cold that sank through bone and marrow until even fire seemed a fragile shield. Garrett sat in his chair by the hearth, the long knife he had been sharpening balanced loosely in his rough hand. He had grown used to the rhythm of silence, steel across stone breath, steady the crackle of burning pine. It had been years since anything unexpected broke through that quiet. Years since another human voice echoed inside those walls. That was why the knock startled him, not loud, not hurried, but soft, steady, and so unsure it carried desperation in its hollow thud. He froze the knife forgotten in his grip. A second knock came, then a third weaker, almost pleading. Whoever stood outside had used the last of their strength to summon this chance. Garrett rose slowly, every instinct forged by years of solitude whispering caution. In the mountains, strangers rarely meant safety. Yet this knock did not ring of threat. It carried something else, despair, and behind despair always waited frostbite hunger and the kind of death no man should face alone. He moved to the door, pressing his palm flat to the wood, listening. The wind whimpered through the seams, not screaming, as it did when storms tore through the pines, but low and broken, as if even the storm carried sorrow. When Garrett pulled the door open, the scene froze him where he stood. A woman soaked to the bone, her lashes crusted with snow shawl, stiff with ice. Behind her, two children clung together. The older boy, no more than 10, wrapped one thin arm tight around a girl of 6, shielding her as best he could. The woman's lips were cracked raw, her skin pale as stone, yet in her eyes burned something fierce, something stubborn, a spark of hope that refused to die. Garrett stared at her, then at the children. His voice rasped from disuse. "You lost!" She tried to speak, but her voice broke before words could form. She nodded once, then again, the movement more apology than answer. Garrett stepped aside. She stumbled across the threshold, knees buckling. He caught her by the elbow before she fell. The boy guided his sister inside with a seriousness far beyond his years. Garrett shut the door against the storm, sealing the fragile spark of warmth inside. He tossed heavy furs toward the hearth. The children sank into them as if heaven itself had opened. The woman knelt, gasping shallow breaths, too proud to beg, too weak to stand. Garrett lifted her easily, placing her in his mother's old chair. She weighed less than a sack of flour, her bones sharp beneath the fabric. He poured hot water into a tin cup and pressed it into her trembling hands. At last her voice returned, a whisper. "Martha, Martha Lindley." She pointed to the children. "Thomas? Sarah." Garrett nodded, crouching near the fire, feeding it another log. Questions could come later. For now, survival came first. The cabin filled with the sound of fire and breath, but beneath it lay something else Garrett had not heard in years, the presence of others breaking the hollow weight of silence. He fetched clothes long stored away, an old wool shirt, socks, a dress that had belonged to his mother. He handed them over without words, then stepped outside to give them privacy. Snow stung his face. He stared at the dark line of trees, the cabin built by his father behind him, the grave dug by his own hands a decade later. For years he had chosen solitude, telling himself it was preference. But now, with a widow and 2 children inside drying by his fire, he felt the lie unravel. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was only tired, tired of silence, tired of pretending solitude was strength. When he returned, the children huddled near the fire. Sarah already asleep, Thomas, watching every movement with wide, wary eyes. Martha's cheeks glowed with firelight instead of frost. When Garrett asked what had happened, her voice cracked as she told of a husband lost to feverland, turned to dust, a cabin roof crushed under early snow. They had walked 5 days through the storm. Garrett listened, silent, then said only, "You did right." She blinked at him, startled, as though those 3 words were mercy greater than food or fire. He ladled stew into bowls, rabbit meat swimming in broth. The smell filled the cabin. Thomas's stomach growled loud enough to rattle the flames. "Eat," Garrett said simply. They obeyed, savoring each bite like it was treasure. When the bowls were empty, he pointed to the back room. "Bed's in there. You take it tonight. I'll sleep in the chair." Martha began to protest, but Garrett cut her off. Not after 5 days in snow. She nodded, guiding the children to warmth. When the door clicked shut behind them, Garrett sat again by the fire, staring into the flames. Something had shifted. A knock had brought strangers to his door. Yet already they felt less like strangers, and more like the beginning of something long denied. He almost allowed himself to rest. Then came the sound that ended his peace hooves in the snow, slow, steady, deliberate. Garrett rose, rifle in hand, knowing that whatever he had welcomed into his home would not go unchallenged. The hooves drew closer, crunching the snow in a rhythm too measured to belong to men lost in the storm. Garrett pressed his back to the log wall rifle, heavy but steady in his hands. He peered through the frost-streaked window. Two riders emerged from the trees, their lanterns swaying, casting long, crooked shadows across the drifts. Horses' well-fed coats, glossy despite the weather. Men like that didn't stumble by chance into these peaks. They came with intent, and intent usually carried a price in blood. The tall one dismounted, first lean frame, wrapped in a coat too fine for mountain hardship. His shoulders slouched, but his movements carried arrogance, as though the world bent beneath his boots. The second was heavier, broad-chested, each step sinking deep in the snow, the sort of man who believed nothing could touch him. Garrett's jaw tightened. He had lived long enough to know the type. They halted just short of the porch voices, carrying in the brittle air. "Evening up there," the tall one called, smooth as polished glass. "Fine little cabin. Fire in the chimney smoke, rising steady. Only place burning between here and the ridge." His smile glinted, false warmth writing his words. Garrett stayed silent. He knew silence could be sharper than any insult. Men like these expected excuses, nervous chatter. When met with nothing, it unsettled them. The heavier man chuckled, low and cruel. "Reckon he's home. Smoke don't rise itself." The tall one stepped closer, lantern light licking across his sharp features. "We ain't trouble, friend. Just cold men looking for warmth." Garrett finally answered, his voice rough as gravel dragged across stone. "Fire's mine. Trail's wide enough for you to make your own." The tall one's grin faltered, jaw clenching, though his smile clung on. "We ain't passing through. We're looking for someone. A woman. Couple kids. Might have lost their way." The words hit Garrett like a hammer. His gut tightened. He thought of Martha's cracked lips, of the boy's wary eyes, of the way the woman's voice had trembled when she whispered her name. He had suspected she was running from more than hunger. Now he knew. His rifle stayed across his chest steady. "Ain't seen a soul in weeks." The tall man's eyes narrowed, searching Garrett's face for cracks. The heavy one spat into the snow, muttering, "Smoke that steady don't feed just one belly." Garrett's silence was answer enough. The tall man raised his hands, mockery painted as peace. "No harm tonight, friend, but we'll be back. Ain't many places to hide in these mountains, not when folks are looking for what belongs to them." He swung onto his horse lantern, swinging like a hungry eye in the dark. The heavy man followed, boots crunching, slow, deliberate. They vanished into the trees, leaving only the echo of hooves swallowed by the storm. Garrett remained by the window long after, rifle never lowering. His breath fogged the glass as he watched the darkness swallow their lanterns. Only when the silence returned did he turn toward the back room. The door creaked softly open. Martha sat upright on the bed, arms tight around her children. She didn't need to ask. Her eyes already held the question. "They're gone," Garrett said, voice low and even. Her shoulders sagged with relief, but fear clung to her face. She knew as well as he did they would return. That night Garrett did not sleep. He sat in his chair by the fire, rifle across his knees, watching the flames burn low. The knock that had brought a widow and her children to his door had been no accident. It was the beginning of something larger, something dangerous. Yet when dawn broke pale and brittle, Garrett did not send them away. Instead, he set to work. He checked traps strung along the ridge, tightened latches on the door, stacked wood high against the wall. By mid-morning, Thomas joined him, bundled in clothes far too big, eager to help. Garrett placed a small hatchet in the boy's hand, guiding him how to split kindling. The boy listened with tight jaw and wide eyes, sweat beading quickly on his brow. Inside, Martha moved with quiet purpose, cleaning the cabin, patching torn curtains, scrubbing soot from the stew pot. Sarah found wooden carvings Garrett had long forgotten, bears, foxes, horses, and traced their shapes with tiny fingers, her laughter thin but bright. By evening, the cabin felt changed, not empty, not lonely, alive. Garrett placed 2 revolvers on the table, their iron glinting in the firelight. Martha froze at the sight. Garrett spoke flatly. "They'll come with more next time." She didn't argue. No fear flashed in her eyes, only weary acceptance. Later, as the children slept, Martha looked across the fire. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked softly. Garrett stirred the embers with the poker. "Because everything I love got taken down there," he said. She nodded, not with pity, but with understanding, as though she too knew the cost of loss. Silence filled the cabin, then no longer empty, but full. For the first time in years, Garrett felt it wasn't his burden alone. The wind had settled into a hush, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Garrett felt it in his bones that silence never lasted long. He tightened the latch on the shutters, fed more wood into the fire, and checked the rifle slung against the doorframe for the third time that day. The children played quietly with the carvings on the rug, their laughter muffled by caution, while Martha stitched a tear in one of Garrett's old shirts. On the surface it was domestic, almost peaceful, but underneath the air hummed with waiting. When the dogs outside barked not once but steady and sharp, Garrett's head snapped up. Lanterns flickered between the trees, 5, maybe 6 swaying lights moving slow, deliberate. His gut clenched. This was no passing storm. They were back. "Martha," he whispered, already reaching for the rifles. Her needle froze mid-stitch. She saw the look in his eyes and didn't ask. Garrett shoved one rifle into her hands, the other across his chest. His voice was firm but low. "Sell her. Now." Thomas's wide eyes darted to him, searching for direction. Garrett crouched, pressing a hand to the boy's shoulder. "Take your sister. You remember the trap door? Stay quiet till I call." Thomas swallowed, jaw tight, and nodded. He scooped Sarah into his arms, the little girl's head bearing against his shoulder. Martha paused at the cellar entrance, her hand brushing Garrett's. "You'll let me know." He met her gaze, steady as stone. "I will." She nodded once, then disappeared below the trap door, closing soft under the rug. Garrett dragged a fur across it, hiding the seam, and moved to the window. The shadows outside shifted, boots crunching through snow, voices low and confident. These men weren't rushing. They had time, and time was a weapon. Then came the knock, heavy, bold. 3 strikes rattling the frame. "Friend," a voice called, too smooth, too loud. "We know you've got something inside that don't belong to you. A woman, 2 brats. You send them out, we leave peaceful. No harm." Garrett cracked the door just enough to show the barrel of his rifle. His words were ice. "You're not taking anyone." A smirk slid across the man's face in the shadows. "She didn't tell you, did she? Her man owed us. Made a deal before he died. That girl's the payment. Not even her blood, just what's fair." Garrett's stomach burned, hot fury rising like fire in dry pine. He leveled the rifle. "You're not taking her." The man sighed almost theatrically and gave a whistle. Gunfire split the night. Bullets chewed into the frame, splinters flying across the room. Garrett dropped low, returning fire through the gap. A scream cut the air. One lantern fell shattering against the snow flames, licking up before smothering out half the yard, plunging into shadow. Chaos roared. Men shouted, horses reared, boots thundered on the porch. Garrett slammed the door shut, braced his shoulder against it as glass shattered from the window. He fired again, another man crying out, before falling silent. Smoke thickened inside, the smell of gunpowder mingling with the stew still cooling on the table. A heavy body crashed against the doorwood, groaning under the weight. Garrett shifted, braced, and shoved back, firing point blank through the planks. The thud on the other side told him the fight was thinning, but not finished. Another shadow loomed at the window, a blade glinting in hand. Garrett caught it in time, raised his rifle, and fired. The man dropped without a sound, swallowed by snow. For a heartbeat, stillness returned. Garrett's breath came harsh and fast, sweat mixing with the frost crawling through the cracks. Then a voice rose, deeper, older, carrying weight the others lacked. Garrett Boone. The name struck like a stone. Garrett froze. No one had spoken it in years. His voice came sharp. "Who's asking?" A figure stepped forward from the tree's lantern, light catching silver in his beard, broad-shouldered rifle lowered. "Name's Malcolm Carney. I rode with your pa before the war." Garrett's eyes narrowed, rifle steady. "You're leading these men? I'm controlling them," Malcolm answered, voice gravel deep. "Didn't sign up to take children from women, but you shot 3 of mine. Can't walk away without a choice." Garrett shifted his grip. "My choice is they stay here." Silence stretched taut as a drawn bow. Malcolm studied him, snow falling soft between them. Then he nodded slowly. You give me your word she don't run, I won't come back. But if she does worse, men'll follow. Men who don't care about women or brats. Garrett's voice cut clean. She's not running anymore. Malcolm's eyes softened, barely a shadow of something human flickering there. You're your father's son, he said at last. He turned to his men. Mount up. We're leaving. Grumbles stirred, but obedience held. Lanterns lifted swaying, retreating into the pines. The sound of hooves dwindled, swallowed by snow and silence once more. Garrett stayed where he stood, rifle steady, arms trembling from the weight. Only when the last glow vanished did he lower the gun. The cabin smelled of smoke and bloodwood, scarred with holes, glass shattered across the floor. He moved the fur aside and opened the trap door. Martha climbed out, first eyes wide, children clinging close behind. They're gone, Garrett said simply. Relief washed across her face, but fear lingered in her eyes. She knew as he did this was only the first battle. Thomas stepped forward, suddenly, small arms wrapping tight around Garrett's waist. Garrett stiffened, startled, then slowly placed a calloused hand on the boy's back. The warmth of that touch sank deeper than he expected. Martha's eyes glistened in the firelight. You didn't have to, she whispered. Garrett's voice was low, unyielding. You knocked. That was enough. The cabin bore its wounds like a soldier returned from battle. Holes in the logs, patched with hastily nailed boards, glass shards swept into corners, blood frozen black against the snow just beyond the porch. Yet inside, life pushed stubbornly forward. Garrett rose before dawn as he always had, but the silence he stepped into was different. It was no longer emptiness pressing against him. It was the soft rhythm of breathing from the back room, the occasional murmur of a child's dream, the faint stirrings of a woman shifting under blankets. For years he had thought silence was a friend, but now he realized it had only ever been a weight. When he opened the cellar door, Thomas was already awake, sitting cross-legged, whittling a stick with a small knife Garrett had given him the night before. The boy's movements were careful, intent, the way only someone hungry for approval works. Up early, Garrett said. Thomas nodded, jaw tight, eyes bright with pride. Wanted to help. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then handed him a proper hatchet. Wood piles low. Let's see what you can do. The boy followed him outside, bundled in clothes, two big boots crunching in snow. Garrett showed him how to split kindling, how to plant his feet steady, how to let the weight of the blade do the work. Thomas listened, close, his breath misting in the cold. By the time the sun rose pale above the ridgeline, a neat stack of firewood leaned against the cabin wall. Thomas's grin was small but fierce, the kind a boy wear when he's done something a man would notice. Garrett clapped him once on the shoulder, a gesture wordless but heavy with meaning. Inside, Martha moved with quiet purpose. She scrubbed soot from the iron pot-patched holes in the curtains with careful stitches and shook life back into corners Garrett had long abandoned. Sarah's laughter bubbled as she played with wooden carvings, her small fingers tracing the shapes of bears and horses Garrett had carved in another lifetime. The cabin, once hollow, began to hum with warmth. Garrett watched from his chair as the firelight touched Martha's hair, no longer stiff with frost, but damp with life. Cheeks flushed, her hands steady, even when her voice trembled, telling Sarah stories. He felt something stir in him he hadn't felt in years, not desire, not yet, but the ache of belonging. That evening, after stew and bread were shared, Garrett pulled an old chest from beneath his bed. He laid two revolvers on the table, their iron gleaming in the firelight. Martha froze, her breath catching. Garrett spoke flatly. They'll come with more next time. Best we're ready. Thomas's eyes widened, but Martha reached for one of the pistols with surprising steadiness. She weighted in her palm fingers, tracing the worn grip. There was no fear in her gaze, only weary resolve. Show me, she said. Garrett obliged, guiding her hands, teaching her how to load, how to steady, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. She listened, without flinching, a widow remade by necessity into something fiercer. Later, when the children had fallen asleep, Martha sat across from Garrett, the fire burning low. Her voice was quiet, nearly swallowed by the crackle of logs. Why do you live out here alone? Garrett stirred the embers, his face lit in red and gold. Because everything I ever loved got taken down there, he said. Martha nodded slowly, not with pity, but with recognition, as though her own scars echoed his. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full heavy, with things neither dared yet to speak. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the cabin changed. Garrett and Thomas cut wood together, set traps along the ridges, and hauled water from the stream half frozen with ice. Martha cleaned, cooked, mended, but also stood beside Garrett when he checked the rifles, learning with sharp eyes and quick hands. Sarah's laughter filled the cabin in moments of calm, and even Garrett found himself smiling when she tugged at his beard or handed him a carved horse to guard while she played. Slowly, the ache of loneliness dulled, replaced by the strange weight of responsibility, not a burden, but a tether holding him steady. One evening, as dusk bled across the snow, Garrett watched Thomas practicing with the hatchet, the boy's arms trembling from effort, yet refusing to quit. "You've got grit," Garrett said. Thomas puffed his chest, hiding his grin. "Mama says I take after my pa." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe so, but grit like that, it's yours now. No man can take it from you." The boy's eyes lit in a way Garrett had not seen since the storm first drove them to his door. Inside, Martha watched from the window, her expression soft, eyes shining with something between gratitude and sorrow. When Garrett came in brushing snow from his coat, she spoke in a low voice. "You didn't have to teach him." Garrett shrugged. "Boy's gotta learn. World won't spare him 'cause he's young." She held his gaze steady. "Still, you gave him more in a week than some men give their sons in a lifetime." Garrett turned away, uncomfortable under her eyes, yet warmed all the same. That night, as the fire died to embers, Martha broke the silence once more. "Do you think God sees us out here? Do you think he cares about people like us?" Garrett thought long, the weight of years pressing on his chest. Finally, he said, "I think he sees the ones who cry when no one else hears. And I think he saw you." Martha blinked hard, lips trembling into the smallest of smiles. For the first time in years, Garrett felt the quiet around him wasn't empty. It was full, and it was shared. The days passed with a deceptive calm, each sunrise painting the ridges in pale gold each night, closing in with the hush of snow and the whisper of wind. Garrett knew better than to trust it. Peace in the mountains was borrowed, never owned. He rose before dawn, checked the traps, tightened the shutters, always listening for what didn't belong. And one evening, as the sky bruised purple and the fire inside burned low, the dogs outside barked again, not one warning, but steady, fierce, the kind of bark that carried fear and defiance together. Garrett's blood chilled. They had come back. He moved quickly, his voice low but sharp. "Martha, wake the children." Thomas stirred instantly, fear and readiness etched into his young face. Sarah whimpered as Martha wrapped her in blankets. Garrett shoved rifles and ammunition onto the table, his hands moving with grim precision. He opened the old chest, drew out powder bullets and the second shotgun he hadn't touched in years. Martha stood across from him, her face pale but her eyes steady. She reached for the revolver he had taught her to use, checked the cylinder with trembling fingers that steadied once the motion became familiar. Garrett gave a single nod. Outside, lanterns swayed among the trees more than before. 5, 6, no, at least a dozen. Shadows moved circling. Voices drifted through the night, rough and mocking. Boots crunched closer. Garrett dimmed the fire with a shovel of ash, plunging the cabin into a gloom broken only by the faint glow of embers. He guided Martha and the children toward the trapdoor. "Cellar, stay till I call." Thomas's jaw clenched, but he obeyed, leading Sarah below. Martha hesitated. "You can't hold them alone." Garrett pressed the shotgun into her hands. "Then don't make me." Her eyes met his fire, sparking where fear had been. She nodded, lowering herself beside the window slit he had carved years ago, gun ready. The first knock came like thunder against the door, rattling hinges and bones alike. A voice boomed, too loud, too sure. "Garrett Boone, we know you've got what don't belong to you. Send 'em out, and we'll leave you standing." Garrett's voice carried like iron dragged across stone. "You're not taking anyone." Laughter followed, harsh and hungry. Then the whistle came. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing into the cabin walls, splinters flying. Martha ducked low, returning fire through the slit. One man screamed, the sound cut short. Garrett moved to the other window, firing into the lantern glow. A light fell shattering, plunging half the yard into darkness. Chaos ignited. Horses reared, men shouted, boots thundered against the porch. A body slammed against the door. Garrett braced it with his shoulder, gritting his teeth as the hinges groaned. He shoved back, firing through the wood. The thud outside told him another man fell. Martha reloaded, her breath sharp and fast, but her aim true. Bullets cracked glass, shredding what little remained of the windows. Smoke filled the cabin, the air heavy with powder and sweat. Still, Garrett and Martha held their ground, each shot a defiance, each breath a vow. Then a deeper voice cut through the fray, steady as a mountain storm. Garrett. The name rang heavy, familiar. Garrett's blood turned to ice. He peered through the smoke. A figure stood beyond the ring of light, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded rifle lowered. Malcolm Carney. He remembered him, his father's comrade from a lifetime past, a man who had once fought beside him and now stood leading the pack outside his door. Step out, Malcolm called. We don't have to finish this with blood. Garrett's grip tightened on the rifle. You already started it. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the horse's snorts and the wind's hiss. Martha glanced at him, her face tight but her eyes resolute. She didn't speak, but the message in her gaze was clear. We stand together. Garrett drew a breath steady and sharp. You want her, you'll walk through me first. The men outside shifted, muttering, but Malcolm raised a hand. Not tonight, he said. But you can't hold forever. Others will come. Worse men than these. His eyes locked with Garrett's, something flickering there, regret perhaps, or recognition. Then he lowered his rifle. We'll be back at dawn. Choose by then. With that, he turned, and the lanterns swayed back into the trees, the crunch of boots fading, swallowed by storm and silence. Garrett lowered his gun only when the last shadow vanished. The cabin was wrecked, holes pocked the walls. Smoke stung his eyes, and the floor was littered with splinters and shell casings. Yet they were alive. He moved the fur aside, lifted the trap door. Martha climbed out, children clinging close. Sarah sobbed softly, Thomas's face pale but fierce. Garrett knelt, pressing a heavy hand to the boy's shoulder. You did right, he said simply. The boy's chin lifted proud, despite the fear still clinging to him. Martha's gaze met Garrett's across the wreckage. Her voice was hoarse but steady. They'll come back. Garrett nodded, his face carved from stone. Then we'll be ready. He turned toward the window, staring out at the dark ridgeline. In the glow of fading lantern light, he saw the truth written clear. The storm wasn't the only thing he was fighting. He was standing against a world that believed a woman and her children could be claimed like property. And for the first time in years, Garrett felt the fire in his chest burn hotter than fear. Dawn crept over the ridge like a blade drawn slow, cutting the darkness into pale strips of gray. Garrett had not slept. He sat by the window, rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line. Martha moved silently behind him, stoking the fire back to life, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face lined with exhaustion, yet sharpened by resolve. Thomas stood near the door, clutching the hatchet Garrett had given him, days before his small frame taut as a bowstring. Even Sarah, curled in blankets, seemed to sense the weight pressing down on the cabin. The air was heavy, a pause before the storm. The first sound came low and steady, the horn. Its mournful cry echoed through the pines, rolling down the slopes like thunder trapped in the valley. Garrett rose, his body stiff but steady. Martha froze mid-motion, her hand tightening on the rifle. Then came the hooves, not a handful this time, but dozens, the ground itself trembling beneath their march. Garrett stepped onto the porch, the bitter air cutting his lungs, and stared at what approached. At least 20 riders crested the ridge lanterns, swaying rifles glinting in the early light. In their midst rode Malcolm Carney, broad shoulders draped in a heavy coat, his beard silver against the dawn. They formed a circle around the cabin horses, snorting clouds of steam, men shifting restlessly in their saddles. The elder outlaw raised his hand, and silence fell. His voice carried heavy. Garrett Boone, we gave you the night, now we take what's owed. Garrett lifted his rifle, his stance unwavering. You'll take nothing. The words hung sharp, cutting the air between them. Martha stepped out, then rifle cradled against her shoulder. She stood tall, her hair whipping in the wind, her eyes blazing with fire born of survival. Gasps rippled through the riders, some surprised at her defiance, others angered. Malcolm studied her a long moment before speaking. You'd fight beside him, then, even knowing the cost. Martha's voice was clear, stronger than she knew she had. There is no cost higher than losing my children. I will not be taken. Not by you, not by anyone. The murmur that swept the circle was tense, edged with unease. A younger rider spat. Then let's end it. He spurred his horse forward, rifle raised. Garrett fired before the man could squeeze the trigger. The shot cracked the dawn, echoing through the valley. The rider toppled his horse, shrieking, blood staining the snow. Chaos erupted. Gunfire split the morning bullets, thudding into logs, shattering glass. Garrett ducked behind the porch rail, firing with calm precision, each shot deliberate. Martha knelt beside the door, her hands trembling, but her aim steady. One outlaw tumbled from his horse, another clutched his shoulder, howling. Thomas pulled Sarah to the cellar, sealing her in before crawling back, face pale, but jaw locked with defiance. He clutched his hatchet like it was the only thing tethering him to courage. The yard became a battlefield, snow churning under hooves, smoke curling through the dawn. Garrett fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, his rifle barking until the barrel steamed with heat. Martha reloaded with shaking hands, sweat glistening on her brow despite the cold. An outlaw charged, the porch blade flashing, but Garrett met him with the butt of his rifle, cracking bone, sending him sprawling into the drift. Thomas let out a cry, not of fear but fury, and hurled his hatchet. It struck the snow inches from the man's head, startling him long enough for Garrett to finish the fight. Through it all, Malcolm sat astride his horse, watching his face carved from stone. Finally, as the chaos thinned and the ground lay littered with groaning men, he raised his hand. The gunfire ceased, leaving only the hiss of breath and the groan of the wounded. Enough, he roared. His men froze, pulling back, eyes wary. Garrett stood on the porch, chest heaving, rifle still raised. Martha beside him, her dress torn, her face fierce, despite the fear shining in her eyes. Thomas pressed against the doorframe, his small chest rising and falling like a drumbeat. Malcolm dismounted slowly, boots crunching in the snow. He approached the cabin with deliberate steps, his rifle slung across his back. His hands raised not in surrender, but in restraint. He stopped a few paces from the porch, his voice low but heavy enough to carry. "You've proven your mettle, Garrett. These hills echo with what you just did. But blood draws more blood. Men worse than mine will smell it and come." His gaze shifted to Martha, then back. "You want to keep her? Keep them? Then you'll carry the weight. Their fight is now your fight. Every outlaw from here to the plains will test you." Garrett's eyes, gray as winter stone, did not waver. "Then let them come." His voice was quiet but steady, the words ringing louder than any shout. Martha's hand brushed his arm, not pulling him back, but anchoring him, her silence a vow as firm as his. Malcolm studied them, the corner of his mouth twitching, not quite a smile, not quite scorn. "You're your father's son," he said again, softer this time. Then he turned, mounting his horse with slow, weary grace. "Mount up," he barked. His men grumbled, some casting glares sharp enough to cut, but they obeyed. One by one, the riders pulled back their lanterns, fading into the trees until the snow swallowed them whole. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. Garrett lowered his rifle, his arms trembling, breath burning in his chest. Martha sagged against the doorframe, her knuckles white around the revolver. Thomas leaned into Garrett's side, his body shaking, though he tried to hide it. Garrett placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and strong. "You did well," he said. Thomas's chin lifted, pride burning through the fear. Martha's eyes glistened as she looked at Garrett. "You didn't have to," she whispered, the words trembling with gratitude and disbelief. Garrett shook his head slowly. "You knocked. That was enough." Snow lay heavy across the ridge in the days that followed, muffling the world in white silence. Yet inside the cabin, life stirred with a warmth Garrett had long forgotten. The fire burned steady, not just for him now, but for the 4 souls who filled the small space with breath and movement. Where once the air had hung empty, it now carried the scent of stew, simmering, the faint hum of Sarah's laughter, the rhythm of Thomas splitting wood beneath Garrett's watchful eye. Even the silence had changed. It no longer pressed on Garrett like a burden. It wrapped around him like a quilt, full instead of hollow. Each day became a rhythm of survival and something more. Garrett taught Thomas how to set snares along the ridge, how to pack powder into cartridges with careful fingers, how to stand tall even when fear tried to bend him. The boy's pride grew not loud but steady, each small success shining in his eyes. Sarah followed Garrett like a shadow, her small hands reaching for his wooden carvings, her giggles chasing the ghosts that had haunted the cabin for years. Martha worked with quiet determination, mending clothes, patching the roof, turning the cold corners of the cabin into spaces of warmth. She moved with the weariness of loss, but also with the strength of someone who had decided to keep walking no matter the storm. One evening, as dusk deepened and the fire cast the room in amber glow, Garrett sat across from Martha. The children were asleep, their breathing soft in the back room. For a long time he said nothing, his rough hands working over the rifle stock, smoothing grooves worn deep from years of use. Martha broke the quiet first. "I never thanked you," she said softly. Garrett shook his head. "No need." But she pressed on. "If you hadn't opened that door, we'd have died in the snow. You didn't have to." His gray eyes lifted, meeting hers across the fire. "You knocked. That was enough." The words hung between them, simple yet heavy with everything unsaid. Martha lowered her gaze, fingers twisting in her lap. Garrett set the rifle aside. His voice, when it came, was rough, almost hesitant. "I never had a wife?" Martha's head lifted, surprise flickering in her eyes. He gave a small shrug as though it were nothing, though the words carried years of loneliness. "Figured I wouldn't be good at it. Never met a woman who thought otherwise." The fire popped, filling the pause. Martha studied him, her face lit soft by the flames. She didn't smile, didn't pity. She just said, "You never had the chance to know. Until now." Garrett's chest tightened, the weight of her words heavier than any bullet he had faced. For years he had lived like a ghost among these peaks, believing solitude was his fate. Now across the fire sat a woman who had survived storms of her own, who had walked through snow with children in her arms, who had chosen to stand beside him when guns roared in the night. In her eyes he saw not judgment, not fear, but a quiet strength that matched his own. For the first time in many winters, the silence around him did not feel empty. It felt full. The days lengthened slowly, winter yielding inch by inch to spring. Snow melted from the roof, dripping steady into the earth. Together they rebuilt the porch, mended the fences, tilled what soil could be worked. Garrett drove posts into the thawing ground, while Martha hauled water, Thomas hammering nails with stubborn determination. Sarah chased chickens that had long roamed wild, her laughter ringing through the yard like bells. Piece by piece, the cabin transformed not just a shelter, but a home. One afternoon, as Garrett fixed a roof beam, Thomas called up to him. "You think we'll stay here forever?" Garrett looked down at the boy, his face flushed with effort, his eyes bright with hope. He thought of the battles fought, the men buried by snow, the years he had wasted in solitude. Then he glanced toward Martha. Her sleeves rolled, her hands deep in the soil of a garden that hadn't existed weeks before. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a small nod. Garrett turned back to Thomas. "Forever's a long time, but for now this is ours." That night after supper, Garrett stepped outside. The sky stretched vast above stars, burning sharp and cold. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark. Martha joined him, her shawl wrapped tight, her breath misting in the air. For a while they stood without words, listening to the quiet hum of life inside the cabin. Finally Martha spoke. "Do you ever regret letting us in?" Garrett exhaled, smoke curling toward the stars. "Regret." He shook his head slowly. "For years I thought I wanted silence, thought it was safer. But now," he glanced at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. "Now I know I was just waiting for the knock." Martha's lips trembled into a smile, small but true. She reached for his hand, calloused fingers closing around his. They stood together on the porch, two souls once broken by loss, now bound by something stronger than survival. Behind them, the cabin glowed warm, the laughter of children spilling faint through the cracks. For the first time in decades, Garrett Boone understood he was no longer alone.